Thank you for that excessively flattering introduction. It's so much better than the one I used to, that I first got in Harrogate in North Yorkshire once, when a lady chairman got up with a sheaf of papers in her hand and said, "I'm now going to read you Mr. Davis's biological details." And I have to say, this is a rather amazing environment to speak to you in, this rather sort of centre of city modernism. I mean, bear in mind I'm a Yorkshire Member of Parliament. The things I normally address are more like resistance meetings than political meetings in sort of bars underground. So, when I suppose first took an interest in this subject, I was Shadow Home Secretary, and the meetings I had to address there were not that different either. You know, you went to all sorts of strange things. For example, I used to go and speak to people in prison. It used to give me a problem of how I could open the speech, you know. So it's a privilege to be here. It didn't seem quite right, you know, in Dartmoor. and talking to a load of murderers and fraudsters and rapists and burglars and thieves of various sorts, you know, it's an honour to address you didn't seem right either. So I lit upon a formula which I'll use with you today, which is I'm so pleased to see so many of you here. Now, yeah, work it out. You know, our country has, for a long time, taken as a point of pride that we are blessed with one of the finest police forces in the world. And frankly, even after the problematic headlines, and let's face it, the serious failures of the last several years, it's still really true. You know, we've got a strong tradition of policing by consent, and although Westminster is a bit of an exception, you tend not to see policemen wandering around with guns in London too much. So, you know, we still have the bobby, as it were. And many able and diligent officers do their best to uphold the sort of penal tradition of policing by consent, as it were, being an extension of the public, albeit a number of them now face difficulties, which I'm going to allude to in a minute. But the trouble is, we can't carry on as we are, because that tradition is sort of dissolving. The truth is that the rapidly changing environment in which our police are working calls for what I'm going to refer to again and again in this address as a permanent revolution in policing. That's what we need to do. Now, the police have found themselves in this position for a number of reasons. Changes in the nature of crime, technological changes, financial pressures, very clear, changes in the expectations of the public, changes in the law, massive changes in the law, 3,000 new crimes in the last decade and a half, mostly in the Labour era, and of course a decline in trust in the police, ranging from Hillsborough right up to the issue that takes 20% of my time now, the so-called Plebgate affair, the Andrew Mitchell affair. So the police are going to have to undergo a process of continuous reform. Note the word continuous reform. They're going to have to embrace new methods, new techniques, new technologies, if they're going to continue to protect and serve the public. And those changes won't be easy. Won't be easy at all. And if we are going to succeed, strong leadership will have to be the foundation to the reforms. Now, I don't mean political leadership. Normally, people come here and talk about what the parties do. I don't mean political leadership. Very few Home Secretaries last more than 5 years, almost none, in fact. And indeed, I think I'm right in saying the current Home Secretary is just about to become the longest serving Home Secretary in modern times. And even if they do, they are, by nature of the job, too distant from the street and from the people who are going to carry out the work, to exercise the sort of leadership I'm talking about. I mean, our senior cabinet members basically barely come into contact with the public, barely come into contact with normal life for the period that they are in the job. And you know, when cabinet ministers, in particular when Home Secretaries, try to exercise that direct leadership, we end up with the sort of awful target-based culture that we had that we inherited from the Labour years. So, if we're going to maintain the public's trust in the police, we will need revolutionary police leadership. Outdated cultures and attitudes must be swept away and replaced with modern approaches. And they, the police, must have the courage and the imagination to move forward rather than retreating to the comfort of the status quo. Now, let me start by talking about the nature of crime today. The developed world is seeing less and less traditional crime. Even in the face of high unemployment and economic stagnation post-2008. Crime against a person, against property, once the bread and butter of policing, has steadily fallen over the last 2 decades. Some crimes, such as burglary and vehicle theft, are in even greater decline and in some cases all disappearing. Now, there are many causes, myriad causes for this improvement. Demographic changes are a major factor, but demographics aren't everything. In London, the number of 18 to 24-year-old young men, and in particular unemployed young men, has been increasing in recent years. Now, you'd normally think that group would lead to an increase in crime, and yet the decline in traditional crime in London has been pronounced. Social changes have also been influential. That 18 to 24-year-old group are now increasingly well behaved, more likely to live with their parents, more likely to be in higher education, 2 strong drivers of good behaviour, shall we say. If you knew my mother, you'd know why. Similarly, more effective punitive policies could be argued to be putting pressure on crime. The number of people behind bars has grown substantially, with the prison population almost doubling over a couple of decades. Now, what does prison do? All sorts of arguments about deterrent effects and rehabilitation effects, but what it does do is it takes out of circulation it's the wrong phrase really, highly productive criminals, high effect criminals, should we say. But it's not just that either, because there's an increasing trend in the number of people becoming criminals in the first place. Between 2007 and 2012, the number of people convicted of an offence for the first time fell by 44%. That's an astonishing number. But the most important factor is that criminals have fewer opportunities. During the last period of high volume crime in the 60s and 70s, ordinary people were acquiring cars, televisions, other high value products for the very first time in their lives. Conspicuous consumption placed temptation everywhere. Newly acquired wealth was the perfect fodder for crime. But society adjusted, and now people have burglar alarms, window locks, car immobilizers, safes. Makes a difference. But it's not just that. It's not just the fact it's more difficult for them to access the valuables. It's also the things that once worth stealing have now become less valuable or more difficult to steal. 20 years ago, a stolen video recorder, the equivalent of a DVD recorder today, could be resold down the pub for £100. That's in their money, so about £250 today. Yeah? Now, you could buy that DVD recorder in Tesco's for 20 quid. Rather reduces the productivity of these high productivity criminals, doesn't it? And if they choose to steal the 50-inch television, well, the punishment isn't a prison term, it's a hernia. So the simple truth is that the characteristics of goods that make goods vulnerable to theft are now changing. The Home Office loves acronyms, and it has an acronym called CRAVED, which stands for concealable, removable, available, valuable, enjoyable, and disposable. Right? That's the sort of thing that people steal. You know? And of course, there are very few of them in a modern house. Either they're cheap as chips, or they're too big to move. And indeed, the one sort of burglary, or one set of burglaries that continue to grow are money, jewellery, car keys, and small electronic devices, laptops, iPads, that sort of thing. Yeah? The most obvious items left for opportunistic but unskilled thieves are smartphones. And so, if you want to look at the crime levels in Brixton or one of the other poorer areas of London or poor areas of other cities and so on, you'll find that snatching smartphones is right up there at the top somewhere, particularly from young women. But even they're beginning to be susceptible to countermeasures. If you're tempted to snatch my smartphone, of course, it's got a tracker on it. I'll know where you are, unless you freeze the battery. So, I'm not going to give you any more tips. So it gets more difficult. Now, while technology attracts crime, as I've just intimated, it also offers us solutions to prevent it. The combination of all these factors has made the risk of traditional crime greater to criminals, greater than the rewards. The old causes of crime, such as economic factors, are no longer as influential as they used to be, and we need a new analysis, really. Criminals, faced with the sorts of problems I've described, the risks I've described, haven't, however, simply retired and rejoined society. They've moved their activities, they've been displaced to where the risks are less, the rewards are greater. Now, 10 years ago, that would have been drugs, primarily. That was where many of the people who would have been burglars had gone to. Now, it's not drugs, it's cybercrime, in essence, what people call cybercrime, but I mean in the widest sense, the internet. More than 7 out of 10 frauds today are cybercrimes, and affect every neighbourhood in the country, whether rich or poor. For many, the threat of cybercrime is actually more real and urgent than the risk of physical crime. I'll tell you in a minute about that. We're seeing a huge increase in the frequency of cybercrime attacks at a time when the importance of online communications and commerce is growing rapidly in all of society, top and bottom. And the consequences are dramatic. It was once the domain of individual hackers. Today it's dominated by professional, well-organised and well-resourced international gangs. And while a sort of gang of Bill Gateses might not be particularly intimidating, I don't know how many of you have ever seen West Side Story, which had the Jets and the Sharks. Well, I guess today it would be the Nerds and the Anoraks, but they're less intimidating than perhaps a gang of Cray brothers would be. But they do a great deal more damage, a huge amount of damage. Technology has enabled these groups to commit crimes far beyond their previous capacity. High-value crimes can be committed very quickly, reducing the risk of being caught. The potential rewards on offer are enormous. Why risk spending 20 years in prison for an armed robbery that might, if you're lucky, net you £50,000, when you can steal corporate secrets worth hundreds of thousands or even millions across the world with a few network laptops? And criminals across the world can now steal from anywhere that has an internet connection. Due to its Wild West nature, the internet has been a tremendous boon for transnational crime, allowing offenders from one country to strike another. My bank account was hacked from Israel a few years ago. So it's out of our jurisdiction. Who's going to pursue that? Which police force is going to pursue that? I don't think I'm going to worry Mossad too much with it. So, just as physical crimes deter people from moving into a neighbourhood, cybercrime damages commerce and damages communications in the electronic world. And that erosion of trust is reducing the benefit that's derived from the internet. But the losses to individuals and businesses are no longer purely financial, and they don't discriminate socially. Cybercrime causes breaches of privacy, loss of intellectual property, and damage to business reputations, whether you're a multinational corporation or a struggling sole trader. And think about this, because the CSJ focuses on particularly the least well-off in society and the people struggling to make their way in the world. It's one of the leitmotifs that made it such an important organisation. That sort of cybercrime will damage a big corporation like Sony or whatever. It will destroy the sole trader. It will destroy a man or woman making their way in the world for the first time with a brand new business. If their systems go down, their customer details are stolen, their reputation is wrecked, they're dead. So understand, we tend to think of this as affecting the rich. It doesn't. Like all crime, it kills the poor. So the public are increasingly concerned about that, and of course that's been made worse, I guess, by the Snowden revelations, which has drawn people's attention to the weakness of the internet. And one of the problems for the police, because we're talking about policing, is that the public impression is that the police are not interested in cybercrime. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to call up your local police station and tell them that you've had your credit card hacked or whatever. It's an interesting experience. And the perception is there too that the police are more interested in protecting, if they are interested at all in cybercrime, protecting big business rather than individuals. Let me tell you about a constituency case, because it's a one-off, but it's not a one-off, in the sense that, well, as you'll see, it's a very repetitive issue. A criminal used one of my constituents' credit card, or the details from it, to purchase a brand new flat-screen TV from John Lewis. See, this is a better way to get the flat-screen TV, don't burgle. The television was delivered to an address the very next day by premium delivery, and was actually signed for by the recipient. My aggrieved constituent reported the matter, and in due course it got reported to the Action, Fraud, Crime Reporting team, the people who do that. But he heard nothing further. When he complained, both the police and to John Lewis, he was informed, to his surprise, that he was not the victim. As far as they were concerned, police considered that John Lewis was the victim. And so they might tell, they don't always tell, but they might tell John Lewis what they were doing about it, but they certainly wouldn't tell him. Now, I pursued it because I was curious, and it turned out that the Action, Fraud, Crime Reporting team focuses on detecting crime patterns and only works, and it goes into action when it finds a pattern of behaviour around a particular address. Of course, any competent criminal would have discovered this. I mean, these things don't go undiscovered. And would just change the address. They just move from address to address to address. Normally what these things work through is multi-occupancy tenancies, so you just move on and on and on. And of course, what does that do? That means the action of the police on this completely loses its deterrent effect. It doesn't work. So my constituent, of course, was as cross as can be. He had no idea whether his details were still held by the criminals. He was never told whether the police caught the people who were responsible. And the disruption for him caused by the fraud was immense. Bank details and credit cards had to be changed. And then, of course, even once he's done that, if he forgets to change the bank details or credit card details on one of his accounts and then tries to buy something, it'll hit his credit record. And his credit record can damage his ability to get a mortgage or damage his business. I know of a case, a constituency case, where somebody's credit record damage ended up with their business being destroyed and their marriage failing. So this man is not the victim. Right? Now, the reason I said that this is a one-off is because this is a single example. But think about it. What I've just described to you happens in every single case, because it arises directly out of the policy that the police have pursued with respect to this sort of crime. And I'm not saying the business should not be protected, of course it should be, but they are the least important victim in this context. The protection of them should not be at the cost of the general public. So that response is simply not tolerable, and I choose my words carefully. And for the police to behave like that is simply not tolerable. Why is it important? I think, well, so what? One TV, one whatever. It's important because this, what I've been talking to you about, is the volume crime of the future. Another decade or so, this is going to completely dwarf burglaries. It's going to be your principal interface with crime if this happens to you. I hope it doesn't, but if it happens to you. But of course, the probability of it happening is going to go up and up and up with every year coming. And remember, this is a relatively well-off audience, but poor people have credit cards too. Poor people buy on the internet, probably more even than we do, because they're trying to get the best deal, and actually because they're trying to do that, they may well be exposed to more threat of losing their credit card details. So the point is that we need to improve sharply the police's response to this. Now remember I was talking about continuous revolution. Right? The point about this technology, and I'm just picking a snapshot at one point in the day, as it were, this is going to change over time. The nature of the threat's going to change, the nature of the crime is going to change from one sort of fraud to another sort of fraud. And the police are going to have to be incredibly nimble about this. Now, I'm looking around the room, and I think most people here are under 40. You're a different generation to most police chiefs. As a result, you are more familiar with what I'm talking about than they are. I happen to have done a software degree, and so I'm sort of quirky, I'm unusual in that sense, that for my age group. So just see that what we have to do here, if they're going to do their job properly, is to be able to react to these sorts of criminal problems faster and faster and faster and more in the public interest. So that's just one problem. Second set of problems, financial constraints. It will be difficult to refocus the police, adapt to new technologies and tactics, and undertake the permanent revolution in policing I am talking about. But it will be made even more difficult by the squeeze on budgets. The current review period has seen a real terms reduction in the police budget by 20%. Now, in a public sector area, a 20% reduction is quite spectacular. Most areas of public sector don't see any reductions ever. They occasionally see real ones, but not nominal ones. Now, that's not going to change. The simple truth is that the pressure on all budgets is going to continue. We're still 100 billion in the hole every year at the moment, and it's going to continue to the foreseeable future, maybe for the next 20 years. We may never see in my lifetime another increase in police forces, in policing. So they're going to have to do more with less. And so we should be considering other approaches. And I'm not just talking about policing here, but across the whole criminal justice sector. And let me just give you one example from elsewhere in the world, and I'm going to pick Texas. Because Texas is not really known as a liberal haven in terms of criminal justice policy. But you may or may not be aware that Texas has dramatically reduced the number of people it has in prison. From 2007, the prison population has consistently decreased as a result of dedicated focus on rehabilitation programs. Now, if you look at the British experience, rehabilitation programs have been an unmitigated failure. Whenever we put people onto the things like the ISSP and other high-profile programs, when I was a Shadow Home Secretary, I would have a whale of a time giving the Home Secretary of the day, and I had several, a tough time because the recidivism rates were up in the 80–90%. Much worse than prison, which is bad enough. It's 50 to 60%. But what did the Texans do? What the Texans did was they said, right, okay, you come out of prison. Sorry, I'm brushing pick on you, but there we are. You look appropriate. You come out of prison. You're put in a rehabilitation program, but you keep your prison sentence as a suspended sentence. As so long as you're free and you're on a rehabilitation program, so long as you don't break your parole or whatever the rules are. But if you do, you go back inside for a very long time. It's a very fierce sort of Damocles. So it's a rehabilitation program, but it's not soft in any way. It's not, it's got hard thought process behind it. And we need to look at that sort of thing to sort of maybe challenge our own prejudices, because when I was Shadow Home Secretary, my instant reaction to most proposals for rehabilitation instead of prison was to laugh. So we have to think very hard about that. We have to take other hard decisions, and many of them will be very unpopular with the rank and file policemen. I mean, for example, I don't know what your experience is, but when I go out in the streets and when I do see policemen, they're always in pairs. They're always in pairs these days. That appears to be the standard rule. And I think it's a rule that arises from health and safety regulations this day and age. Well, one policeman is more than twice as good as two policemen in terms of his observation. He's not talking to his mate. He's looking out, not in. He's doing his job. And he's doing it for half the cost of two policemen. So you've got a sort of force multiplier of 4 times if we reverse that. And there'll be all sorts of row, we know it's health and safety. Our streets, remember, have never been safer. Irrespective of the police government, they've never been safer. The level of violence in society is going down over time. people don't always understand why, but it is. And the streets today are safer than when I was in my 20s, considerably. And yet, in those days, policemen went around in ones with no stab vest, no mace spray. They'd probably have a baton somewhere, but I never ever saw one. You know. So they're going to be quite tough decisions to bring about, but it's have to be done. And all this is being done at a time when the police are coming under greater scrutiny than ever before. Around the world, the public are now armed with camera phones, and they're providing an increasing proportion of the reported news. Anyone with a smartphone is a potential reporter. Every moment on the streets is a potentially publicly recorded moment. And we can expect misbehaviour by any state official to be captured on camera. We've seen it in the Arab Spring revolutions, we've seen it in the Intifada, we've seen it all over the place. It has implications here too, because it's what happened with the G20 death of Ian Tomlinson, for which a policeman was responsible. And at that level of public scrutiny, the unblinking eye of vast numbers of cameras immediately to hand, along with the CCTV cameras, which I don't too approve of, is going to be the future. That's going to be the future that our police force is going to have to work in. Now, under that scrutiny, any attempt by a police officer to promote a false version of events is going to be challenged and probably found out. Any allegations of corruption and incompetence within the police will be widely broadcast. The use of excessive and unlawful force will be caught on camera, almost certainly. But whilst that increasing level of scrutiny will make policing in one sense more difficult, tools are also being applied to make policing better. A perfect example of this is the relatively new idea of issuing lapel cameras and microphones for all police officers. It's been tested out by about 6 police authorities at the moment. When it was done in a trial in California, it led to a significant drop in police violence and an 80% reduction in complaints against the police. 80% reduction. Crucially, we can also use technology to increase public involvement in policing. There is a thing called the self-evident mobile app. It was on one of these things, or indeed on Android too, I think. Now, this system basically allows witnesses and victims to report crimes through their smartphones. They can video the crime, they can photograph the crime, they can put in a witness statement, a sort of structured witness statement, and it can all go to an online repository, which then sort of fixes it. Basically, it can't be changed. So what you've got is that most valuable thing in any crime: a contemporaneous witness statement. Because witness statements always change. You know, I mean, I remember vividly when I was about 18 once, I was walking through Clapham Junction. I just played a rugby match, so I had a black eye and a bent nose. And with a friend of mine, and a black Mariah, I don't think they call them that these days, but a black police van pulled up, and the copper jumped out, and I thought, well, I don't know what we've done wrong. And he says, will you lads like to help me? And I said, yeah, what do you want? And thought we were going to chase a criminal or something. And he said, I want you to appear in an identity parade. So we went down the identity parade, and we lined us all up. And the chief policeman came along, and he stopped by me. He said, oh, no, you can't, because I had by now had a Last of Plaster Cross here, great black eye. He said, no, you look too much like a criminal, get out the line. So I was thrown out the line. But even so, when they put the real suspect in the line, the person came out and they picked the wrong person. And that happens in 1 in 3 cases. So witness statements are unreliable innately, but the more contemporaneous they are, the better. And so this self-evident mobile app, very, very valuable. You know? And bear in mind, where do you want your witness statement to be? Well, you need it in the areas where most crimes occur, which tend to be poor areas. We're back to CSJ's leitmotif again. You know, that really it will actually empower people in a high crime area to protect themselves, to make a witness statement this way. What happened? Well, I tell you, the Home Office failed to approve it. Takes forever, they're a bureaucracy. 27 police forces did say they would accept it. That means 16 didn't. But those that did, including the Met, didn't publicise it in any way. They said, oh, well, we can't publicise one commercial operation. As far as I'm aware, there's only one. You know, I don't care if they publicise 2 or 3, but you know, there's only one I'm aware of. So something which could actually engage the public in the way that Robert Peel, when he first created the police, thought of, you know, the police of the public and the public of the police, has not been picked up. Now there's a demonstration of how we could really grab an enormous resource. And I say to you, this is a huge resource we're talking about here, not just a nice technical idea, a little technical app. So it's time for the police to pick up on that, do something about it. Again, I mean, I'm just giving you examples, but I hope you're beginning to see that if you had a police leadership which was imaginative and brave about this, who could see the sort of way things were going, they could respond much faster to this than me just coming along giving out a few good ideas. So that's the sort of technology the police need, and it will help them, if they use that, to crack down on violent and antisocial behaviour. And I could easily see people even sending in anonymous witness statements this way, in order to allow the police to have something to work from when somebody gets mugged or beaten up in some way. And remember, it engages the public. And one of the police problems they have now is that a third of the public do not trust the police. And where do you think that third is mostly located? In the most difficult to police areas of Britain, because that's where the challenges, the ethnic minority issues, the young men who are at odds with the police all are. Now, there are considerable benefits to adopting that sort of technology, or to adopting technology, but there are also risks. It's crucial that the fundamentals of policing don't fall by the wayside. Officers on the street, the public presence of the police are hugely important to community policing. And it pains me to say it, but the police have become too remote from the public they serve. This is not helped by an occasional combative and self-defeating them and us attitude in the police force. Look at the language. The description of officers on the front line, rather than bobbies on the beat, lends a military air to the police force, more suggestive of an occupying force. Now, policing does share some characteristics with high-stress professions such as soldiering and the fire brigades and so on. Soldiers face the threat of bomb and bullet. Firemen have to enter burning buildings. Policemen have to face uncontrollable crowds, violent mobs, drunks, crazed drug addicts, gunmen, gangsters and terrorists. It's no surprise with all of these professions that their members feel a powerful solidarity that supports them collectively in the face of the pressures and threats that they have to manage. That's part of their esprit de corps. You know, when I was a reserve soldier, you know, we had an esprit de corps. We defended each other. We basically were in the game to defend each other. That's what we did. And so it's important, that esprit de corps, but it carries a cost, a penalty that makes the task of leadership in the police force more difficult and more important. It can turn into mutual defensiveness. So that when a mistake is made, when something goes wrong, when you shoot the wrong person, Jean-Charles de Mene says, the first reflex may not be to correct the error. The first reflex may be to defend each other against the coming storm. Now that's understandable. You know, and listen, if I'd been one of the police officers dashing down into that tube station to deal with what they thought was yet another Al-Qaeda member, I would have been terrified. You know, I'd have been scared stiff. I don't know how well I would have dealt with it. And for that reason, we said at the time, we must not prosecute or discipline these people. They were putting their lives at risk. They might have been blown to bits if it had been a real terrorist. So you can't do that, but you must learn from it. But the problem was that collective defence mechanism leads to people saying things that are not wholly true or bending the truth or whatever. We saw it with Hillsborough, we saw it with G20, we saw it with Jean-Charles de Mene, and more up-to-date scandals, which I'll leave alone. But they have undermined the reputation of the police. And it's those negative perceptions that stop the police being part of the communities they serve. The police, the public, must remember that they're all neighbours, relatives and friends. And we must work to stop the attitude within the police that the public, and especially the least fortunate amongst us, are the enemy to be treated with suspicion. I believe that in the future the Peel model, the police of the public and the public of the police, is the only one that will work. In the era of mass scrutiny that we're talking about, it's the only model that will work. The sort of American style model, a more aggressive model, will fail. And as you'll have seen with the sorts of things that have happened in America. So, what's the consequence of where we are now? Well, that lack of trust means people will not be forthcoming as witnesses. It means that when the police have a success, it'll be seen as flawed. There are all sorts of costs that arise from it. So the police should listen to the criticism of the public and act to address any concerns swiftly and transparently. Now, I think that one of the consequences of this is we should recognise reality in this. We should say to ourselves, well, it's actually asking inhuman behaviour from people to say, well, you know, you're all part of the same team, but when something goes wrong, one part of the team is going to look at another part of the team and sort it out. I mean, you're going to get the sort of cover-up that's historically been a problem, not just in our police force, in every single police force in the world. So what do? Well, I think we should make the IPCC, the Independent Police Complaints Commission, much, much stronger. We should give it more legal powers, much more money, give it an internal career structure. You should turn them into a set of untouchables. So when something goes wrong, the untouchables actually come in and investigate it. And what's more, I'd give them their own prosecuting arm too. Not just, you know, so that even the Crown Prosecution Service, who deal on a day-to-day basis with the police, are not required to put their relationship to one side. So you actually have a fierce, separate body with every arm: investigation, arrest, interrogation, prosecution, all within the same remit. And that won't be popular either. The police would hate that because it implies distrust. But what I'm saying is, it's not putting an unreasonable burden on them in the future when we need to ensure that the police honesty is not going to come under challenge. So, that all requires huge leadership. Leadership that can't be done at the level of Home Secretary, no matter how talented the Home Secretary is, or the level of Police Minister, ditto, or even, frankly, the Police and Crime Commissioner. It's got to be done at the level of the police leadership themselves. And that has implications, which we might talk about in questions, for how you select and train that leadership. Because it simply has got to do something which it's not had to do for 200 years. Of course, there will be a role for the public and their representatives to hold the police to account and to keep the requirement for performance upon them. But that role is not one of giving out command and control instructions. It's not of telling them what to do. It is of saying, this is the level of service we want, and it's up to you to determine how to find it. You know, and we can see the use of some of the technology even in that. And when I was Shadow Home Secretary, we championed the use of crime mapping, which tells you an awful lot about how crime works and where it's focused and where the problems, where the weaknesses are. And you know, it still hasn't been used anything like to its full extent, but that will enable the accountability process to work. So, despite some undeniably good fundamental policing, we have had a time of trouble for our police force. And we need to recognise that. We need to recognise that that's not going to get any easier. The issues they face are not going to get any easier, and we have to make it possible for them to deal with. And again, I'll return to the leitmotif of the CSJ. Remember, the poorer you are, the more policing matters to you. I have arguments about education and grammar schools and Lord knows what else on social mobility. Nothing kills social mobility like growing up on an estate where crime is dominant. And I've known estates around the country where a smart kid will come to the conclusion that the richest man around is the guy who drives around in the car with the darkened windows, who runs the drug racket. You know, where a 12-year-old can make 30 quid by delivering drugs. You know, that kills social mobility. That undermines the spirit of our society. That destroys the fabric that CSJ has been so good at arguing for the rebuilding of. Crime has no social conscience. It targets the poorest and the richest in society, but as I said about the companies, it's the poorest that pay the biggest price. So, by targeting crime, we are working to improve communities and protect the vulnerable across society. Now, the rank and file of the police will fear change. And given the changes they've witnessed recently, the terms and conditions, the pensions, all of that stuff, they're going to be, that fear is going to be understandable. But change is inevitable. Society is changing rapidly, crime's evolving just as fast, and the police must keep pace. Think back 10 years. We have seen most of the areas of public and commercial life change almost beyond recognition in 1 decade. Most of us now do our banking and our shopping online. We store all our books on a Kindle. We can access the entire internet from anywhere in the world. If we want to learn something, we no longer read instructions, we look at a YouTube. All these things have transformed in 1 decade. Industry is now increasingly automated, with machines performing, or robots performing the most repetitive, boring and sometimes dangerous jobs. Even the research for and the writing of this speech is different to what it would have been 10 years ago. It's taken 3 times as many researchers. Thank you, Google. Technology has transformed our towns, our industry, our high streets and our habits. And yet, during my lifetime, policing has barely changed at all. Barely changed at all. And it's time for policing to join the revolution. The pressures are increasing, the challenges are piling up, and there must be no delays. And the challenges, the police force are growing and changing rapidly, their response must be just as swift. And I come back to the point, you know, it has to be a continual pace. And since you've invited me to such a swish place, I'll tell a story about a swish place. I was at the Freedom Conference last week, which was in the Guildhall. And whilst I was listening to V.S. Naipaul talk about something or other, I couldn't really understand it. It's too difficult for me. My mind was wandering, and I saw all these statues on the side, Wellington and others, and Churchill, the bronze of Churchill. And it reminded me of one of the last meetings that Churchill addressed. He was 76 years old when there was the British Temperance Union invited him to go speak to them in the Guildhall, enormous hall, enormous central hall of the Guildhall. And the lady chairman said, Sir Winston, my organisation is full of admiration for your leadership in war and your statesmanship in peace. But I have to tell you that they do not approve of your bibulous tendencies. We've calculated that in your life you have drunk wine, whiskey, gin, port, champagne, enough to fill this Guildhall up to your chin. And Churchill leaps to his feet and says, Madam, he looks around the huge size of the hall and says, Madam, when I think of my advanced years, and I look at the size of this hall, all I can say is, so little time, so much left to do. And that really should be the motif of the police leadership in this country. And it should be the motif that we encourage them to pursue. And we should give them the freedoms to pursue it and create around them, not a command and control structure that says you will fix this year, you will fix that next year, but a structure which just encourages them to do better and better and better every year against a tougher and tougher environment. And if we do that, then just one of the enormous barriers, insuperable barriers, that face the poorest kids in our society will be removed, and then we will be able to look forward to an era of renewed social mobility in Britain, long later than it should have been. Thank you very much.